The blue and red light came first, the way it always does in this story, strobing through thin curtain fabric and painting the living room wall in alternating cold colors before the sound of the engine even registered. Dara Kinsley stood at her front window with a dish towel in her hand and watched the patrol car roll to a stop in front of the gray craftsman house at the end of Copperhead Lane. 4 motorcycles sat in the driveway. A small plume of smoke from a kettle grill drifted over the fence. She could hear the low murmur of men's voices, nothing aggressive, just the particular hum of people gathered together on a warm October evening, and she watched the officer climb out of his cruiser and walk toward the front door with the unhurried authority of someone who had been here before. She did not know yet that everything about to happen on this street began with her daughter and a lost dog. She did not know the name of the man who opened that front door, or what his name meant in this part of Oregon, or what it meant for the piece of paper filed in the county recorder's office, under the name of a trust she had never heard of. She only knew that her neighbor was being questioned by a police officer again, and that the man responsible for the call was already watching from the bay window of the white colonial 2 houses down. A phone pressed to his ear, a look of quiet satisfaction moving across his face like weather. Dara had lived on Copperhead Lane for 14 months. She had taken the house because the rent was $200 below anything else she could find in a 40-minute radius of the warehouse where she worked the swing shift, and because the school district was decent, and because her daughter Petra had pointed at the big oak tree in the backyard and said it looked like it had been waiting for them. The lane itself was short, 8 houses on a dead-end spur off a county road, each lot generous, each house separated from its neighbor by a reasonable margin of old-growth hedge or board fence. It was the kind of street that looked, from the outside, like the kind of street where nothing happened. It was not that kind of street. She had understood within the first month that Rex Colton was the reason nothing stayed quiet on Copperhead Lane. He was 52, retired from a position with the city planning office that he referenced as often as the situation allowed, and he ran the Copperhead Lane Neighborhood Association with the focused intensity of a man who had mistaken administrative authority for moral standing. He drove a white SUV that never had a speck of mud on it. He wore pressed khakis to his own mailbox. He had called non-emergency dispatch on the Craftsman at the end of the lane 14 times in the 18 months before Dara arrived, a number she would not learn until later, though she could have guessed at the scale of it. The first time she attended a neighborhood association meeting, 3 weeks after moving in, Rex had presented her with a laminated copy of the HOA covenants and explained, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that the lane had standards it had worked hard to maintain. He said the word standards, the way some people say a prayer, with the conviction of someone who believed the word itself was doing work. The man at the end of the lane did not attend neighborhood association meetings. His name was Mitchell Okafor, and he had lived in the Gray Craftsman for 11 years, and the men who knew him well enough to use the name called him Torch. He was 57 years old. He was built like a man who had spent a significant portion of his adult life doing physical labor and had never entirely stopped. His beard was gray at the center and darker at the edges, trimmed close on his jaw and fuller below his chin. Both his forearms were covered in work that extended up over the collar of whatever he happened to be wearing, and his hands were the kind of hands that do not look like they belong to someone who sits behind a desk. The leather vest he wore on the days he rode carried a death's head patch on the back, and the words Hell's Angels in an arc above it. The Eugene chapter's rocker curved below. He had been the president of that charter for 9 years. He held an emeritus title now, which in practical terms meant the men still listened when he spoke, and the younger ones still stood straighter when he walked into a room. Dara did not know any of this on the Thursday evening in the first week of October, when her daughter Petra came to the back door and announced, with the particular controlled panic of a 9-year-old who was trying very hard not to cry, that Biscuit had gotten under the fence. Biscuit was a beagle of advanced age and inconvenient independence, and he had apparently located a gap in the board fence at the far corner of the backyard and departed through it before anyone had noticed. Dara went out with a flashlight and called the dog's name in the gathering dark, scanning the side yards and the hedgerows, and it was Petra who finally pointed toward the end of the lane and said the dog had gone through the gate in the old man's fence. She had seen him go. The old man's fence was the craftsman's fence. Dara stood at the end of her driveway and looked at the light coming from the porch at the end of the lane and thought about the leather vest and the motorcycles and the men she had seen coming and going. And she thought about her daughter's face, and then she took Petra's hand, and they walked down the lane together. The porch light was on. There was a wind chime made of old bolts hanging near the door, and it made a low industrial sound in the evening air. Dara raised her hand to knock, and Petra knocked first. 3 sharp raps with the confidence of a child who has not yet fully absorbed the catalogue of adult fears. Boots crossed the wooden floor. The door opened. The man who filled the doorframe was exactly as large as he appeared from 2 houses away, and when he looked down at Petra, he did something with his expression that Dara would later describe to herself as a quieting. Not softness exactly, something more controlled than softness. He looked at the small girl on his porch the way a person looks at something that requires their full attention and deserves it. "Your dog," Petra said, "is in your yard. He went under your fence. His name is Biscuit." Mitchell Okafor looked at the girl for a moment, then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come on, then." He found the dog in under 4 minutes, which suggested to Dara that Biscuit had made his presence known and had been observed and was simply awaiting a formal retrieval process. Torch carried the beagle back to the porch with one hand, the dog's legs hanging with an air of complete indifference to the indignity of the situation, and set him down in front of Petra with the careful precision of someone returning a borrowed tool. Petra threw her arms around the dog. Torch watched this. Dara said thank you, and he said it was no problem, and they stood on the porch in the cooling evening air for a moment that stretched slightly longer than formality required. He asked if she was the one who had moved into the Hargrove rental. She said she was. He said the Hargroves had been good people, and he hoped the place was treating her well. She said it was. He looked at her once, the kind of look that takes inventory without being rude about it, and then he nodded and said good night. And she walked back up the lane with her daughter and the dog, and the feeling of having been seen by someone who did not make a habit of seeing people unless they were worth seeing. She thought about that look Monday evening when the patrol car came back. She was pulling into her driveway after picking Petra up from her sister's, and she saw the cruiser in front of the Craftsman again, and she saw Rex Colton's white SUV idling at the far end of the cul-de-sac, and she felt something settle cold in her chest. There were 4 bikes in Torch's driveway, same as the Thursday before, and she could smell the grill smoke from the road. She could not hear anything aggressive. She could not see anything that would justify a police response by any standard she recognized. She watched the officer knock and speak and eventually walk back to his cruiser with the satisfied slowness of someone who has discharged an obligation without any real consequence to show for it, and she watched Rex's SUV pull quietly away before the patrol car had even turned around. The certified letter arrived Tuesday morning, slipped through her mail slot before 7. Rex Colton, acting as president of the Copperhead Lane Neighborhood Association, was summoning her to a special session that same evening at 6. He had attached, in a transparent plastic sleeve, a notice of 2 code violations against her property. The first was a citation for allowing vegetation to grow past the approved height limit on the south-facing fence line. The second was a citation for a structure in the backyard not reflected in the current property improvement documentation. A reference, she realized, to the wooden play set that had been in the yard when she moved in, and that the Hargroves had left for Petra's use. She stood in her kitchen in her work clothes and read the letter twice. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. The session was in Rex's dining room, and it was not a meeting so much as an audience. Rex sat at the head of a long table with 2 other association members flanking him. A retired teacher named Bert, who had moved to the lane the year before, and who had, as best Dara could tell, simply decided that agreeing with Rex Colton was easier than not, and a woman named Carol, who ran a small tax preparation business from her home and who kept glancing at the door as though measuring the distance to it. Rex set the violations on the table between them and explained, with the particular patience of a man who enjoys explaining, that the lane had standards, and that the standards were not personal, they were structural, and that he hoped she would understand the association's obligation to maintain the kind of community that made property values possible. He said property values the way other people say civilization. He had a legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he clicked the pen twice before he began, which she recognized as a person arranging the ritual of authority before they exercised it. He slid a form across the table. The form was a compliance agreement. It stipulated that she would remove the playset, trim the vegetation, and submit to a follow-up inspection within 30 days. Below those items, in smaller text that she had to lean forward to read, was a clause granting the association the right to assess fines of up to $300 per day for non-compliance. She read the clause twice. She put the form back on the table without picking it up. "I'm a renter," she said. "I don't own the property. You'd need to send this to the Hargroves." Rex smiled. "The violations are assessed against the occupant of record. That's you, Miss Kinsley." She looked at Bert. He was studying his hands. Carol had found something interesting in the middle distance beyond the window. She said she would need to consult with the property owners before signing anything that pertained to structural changes. Rex's smile stayed in place and his eyes went elsewhere, sliding toward the window with the practiced absence of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to acknowledge it. He said she should do that, and that the 30-day clock was already running, and that he hoped she understood the association's position had nothing to do with her personally. He said nothing to do with you personally, with the cadence of someone who was saying the exact opposite. He held out a business card with the association letterhead printed on it, the kind of card a person keeps in a card case and presents with a specific intent, and she took it because not taking it would have been a small, useless gesture at a moment when she needed to preserve every ounce of composure for the ones that would matter. The night air outside was cold and tasted of wood smoke from somewhere down the county road. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The windows of Rex's Colonial blazed with warm light that looked welcoming from the outside and was not. She could see the association meeting still going through the curtains, the shapes of people wrapping up proceedings, and she thought about the play set and the 30-day window and the $300 a day and her rent, which was $1,400 a month, and which left approximately $260 in her account after the utility bills were paid. And she thought about Petra asleep at her sister's, and about the Hargroves, who were good people in another state who did not know what was being done to their property in their absence. She did not cry. She had long since learned that crying was a luxury that required time she did not generally have. She started the engine. She sat in her parked car in her own driveway for 4 minutes before she got out, and she did not tell herself it was fine because it wasn't fine, and she did not tell herself she would figure it out because she didn't know yet how she would. She got out of the car. She stood in the driveway. The oak tree in the backyard was a dark shape against a darker sky, and Biscuit was watching from the front window with the concerned attentiveness of a dog who understands that his person has returned, but suspects the evening went badly. Down the lane, the porch light at the Craftsman was on, the bolt chimes moving faintly in the night air. She did not know what made her walk toward it. She had no particular plan. Her feet carried her, and she let them. He answered the door in the same vest. He looked at her face, and whatever he read there made him step back from the door without her having to ask. She sat at his kitchen table and told him what had happened. Not all of it, but enough. He listened without interrupting. His kitchen was clean in the way that specific and practical men keep spaces clean. Nothing unnecessary, everything where it belonged, a coffee maker that looked like it had been in service for a decade and would go another decade yet. He poured her coffee without asking and set it in front of her, and sat across from her, and listened to the rest of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been running this association?" Torch said. "Before I moved in," she said. "I don't know exactly." "I do," he said. He told her something then that she did not entirely understand, only that it had to do with a plat filing and a trust and the county recorder's office, and that he was going to make a call. She asked what kind of call. He looked at her the same way he had looked at Petra on the porch, that full and quiet attention, and said it was the kind of call that would make things clearer. She drove home with the coffee still warm in her chest and the code violation form on her passenger seat, and the particular feeling of a door that had been closed for a long time, swinging open onto an unfamiliar room. The call Torch made was to a man named Navarro Tesh, who was 31 years old and not much bigger than average, and whose patch said Prospect on the chest and Hell's Angels on the back, and who could find, in approximately the time it took to drink a single cup of coffee, more about a person's financial and institutional history than that person had ever intended to make findable. Navarro arrived at the Craftsman the next morning with a laptop and a quiet efficiency that reminded Dara, when she arrived at 9 and found him already at the kitchen table, of a surgeon arranging instruments. He looked up at her, nodded once, and returned to the screen. Torch set coffee in front of both of them and let Navarro work. What Navarro found took 3 hours and produced, by the end of it, a document 37 pages long that neither Dara nor Torch read in its entirety at the table, but that Navarro walked them through in the flat, precise voice of someone for whom facts are simply facts, neither surprising nor satisfying in themselves, only relevant to the problem at hand. Rex Colton had been the deputy director of a city planning subcommittee for 11 years. In the final 3 years of that appointment, the subcommittee had approved 4 rezoning applications that, taken together, had increased the assessed development value of a 12-block area that included Copperhead Lane by roughly 40%. During that same period, a consulting firm called Meridian Planning Group had received $180,000 in city contract payments for community impact assessments. Meridian Planning Group was registered to a post office box in Rex Colton's wife's maiden name. Rex Colton had signed off on the contracts, Rex Colton had also, in the 14 months since leaving the city position, accepted a finder's fee arrangement with a Portland-based residential development company that had made written offers on 3 of the 8 properties on Copperhead Lane, all 3 of which had subsequently sold and been absorbed into the same parcel application. 2 of those sales had been preceded by HOA violation notices and sustained fine assessments from the Copperhead Lane Neighborhood Association. The third had been preceded by a noise complaint campaign and 2 police calls. Dara stared at the screen. She said very quietly, "He's been pushing people out." Navarro looked at her. For a $2.2 million corner parcel sale to the developer. He said the number the same way he said all the other numbers, as if it were simply a coordinate. Torch was looking at the wall across the kitchen. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Tell her the other thing." Navarro pulled up a different window. The county recorder's office. A document dated April 1987. Copperhead Lane, it turned out, had been platted in the spring of that year as part of a subdivision development that had subsequently been sold, parceled, and partially dissolved. Most of the associated land rights had transferred in the normal fashion. One had not. The lane easement, the 12-foot-wide access corridor that ran the full length of Copperhead Lane from the county road to the end of the cul-de-sac, was recorded as a private easement held in perpetuity by the owner of the corner lot at the lane's terminus. The corner lot at the lane's terminus was the Gray Craftsman. The Gray Craftsman was held in a trust. The trust was called Okafor Family Holdings. Dara looked at Torch. He was looking at the table. "You own the lane," she said. He looked up. "The easement," he said, "which means any development that needs road access to build on the assembled parcels has to come through me." She sat with that for a moment. The code violation form was in her bag. The playset was in her backyard. Rex Colton was in his white colonial 2 houses away, making calls and feeling invulnerable, and he did not know. He had spent 18 months pressuring the residents of this lane without once looking at the document that made the whole enterprise his to lose. "What are you going to do?" Dara asked. Torch folded his hands on the table. "Nothing yet," he said. "We're going to wait until he gives us a reason to do it in front of witnesses." Rex Colton gave them a reason on Thursday afternoon. He arrived with a city code enforcement officer, a young woman named Martinez who carried a clipboard and looked like she would rather be anywhere else on Earth. Rex walked slightly ahead of her, with the proprietorial ease of a man who has arranged the visit and expects the visit to go as arranged. He rang Dara's doorbell. She answered it. He told her, with the same patient smile, that Officer Martinez was there to document the violations in preparation for the fine assessment process, and that if she wanted to avoid the accumulation of charges, she should sign the compliance form today. He set a new copy of the form on her doorstep as he said this, the same form, still unsigned. Officer Martinez kept her eyes on her clipboard. Dara looked at the form on her doorstep and felt the familiar cold weight in her chest and kept her voice even. She said she was still in consultation with the property owners. Rex said the 30-day window was nearly closed. She said she understood. He said he hoped she did, because the fines would begin accruing at a rate that would quickly exceed her rent, and the association had the right to lien the property and pursue collection through the county, and he would hate to see that process begun against someone in her situation. He said, in your situation, with a particular emphasis that was meant to remind her of what he believed her situation to be. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. and he held her gaze for a moment and then turned to Officer Martinez and said he thought they had seen enough, and they walked back down her driveway together. She was still standing at her open door when she heard it. Engines. Not one. Several, arriving from the county road end of the lane in a low, sustained rumble that she felt before she consciously heard it, a sound that vibrated faintly in the door frame under her hand. She stepped onto her porch. Rex and Officer Martinez had stopped walking. They were standing in the middle of the lane, both of them turned toward the sound. 7 motorcycles came around the turn at the end of the lane in a formation that was not accidental, riding 2 by 2 with a single lead, their headlights burning in the gray afternoon light, despite the fact that it was not yet dark enough to need them. They rolled slowly, evenly, without rush. The sound they made was the sound of something that has decided. They passed Dara's driveway and continued to the end of the lane and pulled into Torch's driveway in a single, fluid movement, the formation folding itself into the space with practiced economy, and the engines cut almost simultaneously, the sound dropping away into a quiet that felt somehow louder than the engines had been. Torch came out of his front door. He walked across his yard to where Rex and Officer Martinez were standing in the middle of the lane, and 2 men came with him. One was Decker Walsh, who was the same width as some doorways and whose expression suggested that he had arrived at a permanent opinion about the world some years ago and had not felt the need to revisit it. The other was Navarro, carrying his laptop. Rex watched them come, and the patience went out of his face the way color leaves a cloth left in the sun. Officer Martinez looked at her clipboard. "Mr. Colton," Torch said. He stopped 3 feet away. He did not raise his voice. It did not need raising. "I understand you've been visiting my neighbors." Rex recalibrated very quickly, producing a version of his smile that was more compressed than usual. He said this was a neighborhood association matter, and that he was not sure what Mr. Okafor's interest in it was. Torch looked at him. He let the silence do work for a moment. Then he said, "Walk with me." Rex did not want to walk with him. What Rex wanted was to be in his white colonial, with his phone and his city contacts and the comfortable armor of institutional procedure, and none of those things were available to him on this lane at this moment, and something in his face acknowledged the fact even as he followed Torch back to the craftsman's porch, because not following would have been its own kind of statement, and Rex was not ready to make it yet. They went inside. Dara followed because Torch had looked back at her once as he walked, and the look said, "Come." Officer Martinez remained on the lane, studying her clipboard with the focus of someone who has decided that whatever was happening in that house was not her department. The kitchen table had Navarro's laptop open on it, and the printed document beside it, and Rex looked at both of them and looked at Torch, and the residue of his smile finally departed. Navarro walked him through it. He did not rush, and he did not editorialize. He stated what the document showed: the shell company, the consulting payments, the finder's fee, the 3 prior sales preceded by HOA enforcement pressure. The second police call on Torch's property, placed from Rex's cell phone to the non-emergency line at 11:47 on a Monday evening. He said the number 14, the total number of police calls from Rex's number regarding this address in the past 18 months, and let the number sit in the room. Decker Walsh stood near the door with his arms folded and looked at Rex the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved in their head. Rex's color had changed. He was leaning forward slightly, his hands flat on the table, and his breathing had become a conscious activity. "You don't have anything?" Rex said. His voice had lost its particular music. "Consulting contracts are public record. HOA violations are documented procedure. This is circumstantial. Torch let him finish. Then he said, Navarro. Navarro pulled up the county recorder's window on the laptop and turned it toward Rex. He explained briefly and clearly what the 1987 plat document said. He explained the easement. He explained the trust. He said the name of the trust. He said that any development requiring road access to the assembled parcels on Copperhead Lane, under the terms of the recorded easement, required the explicit written consent of the easement holder, and that the easement holder was currently sitting across the table from Rex Colton, and that the easement holder had not, at any point in the preceding 18 months, been asked for his consent, contacted by the development company, or made aware that his lane was being assembled around him. Rex looked at the screen for a long time. The developer knows, Navarro said, that their $2.2 million parcel is landlocked without his signature. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the kitchen window, Dara could see two of the club's members sitting on their bikes in the driveway, not doing anything in particular, just present. The weight of them was its own argument. Torch set his folded hands on the table. He looked at Rex Colton across those hands, and his voice, when he spoke, was not angry, which was somehow worse than anger. He said, "You spent 1.5 years trying to run people off this lane, my lane." He let that settle. "You called the police on me 14 times. You put violation notices on a woman who has done nothing to you except live here." He looked once at Dara, and then back at Rex. "You had no idea you were in my house every time you did it." Rex's mouth moved without producing anything useful. "Here's what you're going to do," Torch said. He was not reading from anything. He did not need to. "You're going to go home tonight. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call your HOA secretary, and you're going to withdraw the violations on Ms. Kinsley's property. You're going to withdraw whatever you filed with the city against this address. And you're going to step down from the association by the end of the week." He paused. "And you're going to call your developer contact and tell him the easement holder on Copperhead Lane is not selling." Rex found something close to his voice. He said if they published any of this without due process, it was defamation. Dara said quietly, "The HOA has a meeting scheduled for next Tuesday. There are 5 households on this lane. I'll be at the meeting." Rex looked at her. He looked at the document. He looked at Torch. He said, after a silence that lasted long enough to be complete, "What happens if I don't?" Torch said, "Then Navarro sends the city council the document trail he built today, and the development company learns that their parcel acquisition was being coordinated by a former planning official using city-registered contacts on city infrastructure, and the State Ethics Board receives a copy, and a certain attorney in Portland who handles contingency municipal fraud cases gets a call." He unfolded his hands. "Or you do what I said, and none of that is necessary. Your choice, and you can take a minute with it." Rex Colton stood up from the table. He straightened his collar, a small automatic gesture, the only piece of composure he had left. He picked up his copy of the code violation form, the one he had brought for Dara, and he folded it once and put it in his pocket. And the folding of that document was the quietest possible way for a man to acknowledge that something was over. He walked to the door. Decker Walsh stepped aside without expression. Rex went down the porch steps and across the yard and up the lane toward his white Colonial. And he did not look back, and the 2 club members on their bikes watched him go with the patient attention of men who have nothing in particular to do and all the time in the world to do it. Dara stood on the porch. The code enforcement officer had already left, apparently having determined that the violation inspection would need to be rescheduled at some future date that was never going to arrive. The lane was quiet. The bolt chimes moved in the evening air. She felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not with the finality of a door slamming, but with the incremental loosening of something that had been held too tight for too long, a slow exhale that had been waiting for a long time to be taken. Torch came out and stood beside her on the porch. He did not say anything for a moment. Below them in the driveway, the club's bikes sat in a row, and the men were talking among themselves in the low, unhurried way of people who have done what they came to do. Navarro was on his phone, already somewhere else in his attention. Decker Walsh leaned against the porch railing and looked at nothing in particular. Dara said, "Thank you for not destroying him." Torch looked at her. "You didn't want that?" "He has a family," she said. "I just wanted him to stop." He looked at the lane. He said, "That's what we did." By the end of the week, Rex had withdrawn both violations in writing. By the following Monday, he had stepped down from the association presidency by email, citing personal commitments. The development company's parcel application, filed with the county pending all property acquisitions, sat in abeyance without the easement consent it needed, and eventually, quietly, was withdrawn. No public announcement was made. No newspaper covered it. The institutional machinery that had been aimed at Copperhead Lane simply ceased to operate, the way a clock stops when the spring runs down, and the silence it left behind was indistinguishable from the silence of a street where nothing had ever happened. Dara got a letter from the Hargroves in the third week of October, a handwritten note in which they mentioned they had been thinking about the property, and that if she ever found herself in a position to make an offer, they would rather sell to someone who loved the oak tree than to a developer. She read the letter twice. She put it on the kitchen table. She thought about numbers and time, and the specific kind of possibility that requires you to not look directly at it in order to keep it from dissolving. She did not see Rex Colton's white SUV on the lane after that week. His Colonial sold in January to a young couple with a retriever, and they were the kind of people who waved when you passed and did not know anything about neighborhood associations and had no interest in learning. The lane settled. October became November, became December. The oak tree went bare, and then beautiful. And Petra climbed it with the focused ambition of a person who has decided a tree is a project, and a project is a fact. Biscuit. For reasons that may have had to do with the quality of the craftsman's backyard, or simply with the particular gravitational pull of a man who had returned him without ceremony, developed the habit of standing at the gap in the fence at the far corner of the yard and looking toward the end of the lane with a specific and settled patience. Dara let him look. She understood the impulse. She stopped at the Craftsman one Sunday morning in December with a covered dish, because she did not know what else to bring, and cooking was the language available to her. And Torch opened the door and looked at the dish and then at her and nodded once. Inside, 3 men were watching football in the main room with the contained appreciation of people who consider that a reasonable way to spend a Sunday. Navarro was at the kitchen table with his laptop unchanged. Decker Walsh, sitting in a corner chair, looked at her when she came in and then looked at the television, and then looked at her again with something in his expression that was not exactly warmth, but was not whatever it had been the first time she had seen his face. And she understood that this was, from him, the equivalent of a formal welcome. She put the dish on the counter and Torch poured coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table, and the game played on in the next room, and outside the January wind came in, slow off the hills, and moved the bolt chimes, that low industrial sound she had stopped finding strange. And she thought about the last 14 months and about the Hargrove letter still sitting on her kitchen table, and about the oak tree and the lane that was named in a document nobody had bothered to look at, after the trust of the man sitting across from her. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. The ceramic was warm. The sound of the game drifted through from the other room, low and continuous, and Biscuit, who had apparently followed her without her noticing, came in through the door she had not quite closed, and settled himself across her boots with the absolute confidence of an animal who has decided where he belongs. Torch looked at the dog. He looked at her. He said, "He keeps coming back." She said, "Yeah." He said, "That's how it works on this lane." She looked at the window, at the gray December light and the line of bikes in the driveway, and the end of the lane beyond, and she felt it, not the word for it, but the fact of it, that specific kind of freedom that has nothing to do with movement and everything to do with a room, where the door is never locked against you, where the coffee is already poured before you ask, where the man across the table has already decided you are worth protecting and is not going to make a speech about it. Freedom is quieter than people say it is. It does not announce itself. It sits across a kitchen table and lets the dog sleep on your feet and says nothing more than is necessary and means every word of it. If this story stayed with you, if the moment Dara sat down at that table and felt the lock turn over, felt like something you have needed to feel, share it with someone who might need it. Stories like this one are built for the people who have stood in their own driveways wondering who was in their corner. We are grateful you were here for this one.